Phil, the sky is falling. I don't think I can cope anymore. I'm not certain we're sharing the same reality, the coinus cosmos, objective reality that we all share, or whether this is something else. Help me, otherwise I'll have to call Lies Inc. Hi, this is Steve Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller, and I've fallen down the rabbit hole of Philip K. Dick after that Varles video. I decided it was time to look at something which is covered less, but is, I can't say it's controversial, it is interesting. I can't say it's as important, but it is important. You might get some whiteout from the light here, but don't worry, that's just flashes of the LSD dart you've been shot with surreptitiously, which you didn't even notice. This is Outlaw Bookseller, and we're looking at Lies Inc. This is Lies Inc., which was published for the first time in the UK in 1983. This is the paperback edition that followed a couple of years later. Behind me, with a Gollancz yellow jacket, you'll see the world first of Lies Inc. Lies Inc. is, I guess, a minor novel, but the more you look at it, the more interesting it becomes, and the more it casts light on Dick's sort of working methods, on his consciousness, on his concerns throughout his sort of creative life. And just sort of backtrack, this is going to sort of be quite detailed because it's been sort of obsessing me for the last 3 days or so, and I've done a lot of reading and a lot of research and a lot of thinking about this, so this will go on for a bit. So this is for the real Dick heads out there. For those of you who watched the Varles video, if you haven't watched the KW Jeter one about Dr. Ada, please do, because there are some Dickian references in there and I'm sure you'll really enjoy it. Everybody reads Dick should read Dr. Ada, at least of KW Jeter's work. So Lies Inc. What's the story behind it? Well, Lies Inc. was originally published under the title The Unteleported Man in a magazine back in about 64, and then it was published as half of an ace double in 1966. And this is a Methuen edition from the 70s, which I acquired recently from my friend Nick. And I never bothered to pick this up because I knew that it was a short, unrevised version of Lies Inc. And I bought this paperback new when it came out, same as a hardcover. And it was interesting because I thought, well, I'll read this and see what the differences are. And having read Lies Inc. a couple of times already, and the material around it, I was aware it would be significant in terms of the differences. So, as I say, in 66 it was half an ace double, but at that point Dick had written an extra 30,000 words, which he wanted to get published to expand the novel to a much bigger length. And Ace didn't want to do this, they just wanted to include the original novella magazine version in a double, as I say. By the early 80s, Dick had reread the extra material he'd written for The Unteleported Man, and he just realised that it was quite good, and he decided to revise it. And shortly after that, he died, and nobody knew whether he'd actually done the revisions. No, he'd actually written 30,000 words, as I say, anyway. And in 1983, Berkeley published an expanded edition of The Unteleported Man, which contained those 30,000 words. That's an edition I don't have. I'm going to try and pin that down, because what happened shortly after that was Dick's literary executive found the revised 30,000 words, and apparently they were substantially revised. So I'm looking forward to comparing those two texts, and I'll report back when I do, and I can get a copy of the Berkeley edition. And they also found that there was material missing, so they got John Sladek, a writer who Dick admired, to fill in 2 pages. And if you've got this copy of Lies Inc., and it's probably in all the ones since in the UK, it tells you on the final page, it's a publisher's note, and it says that Sladek made some contributions which are on pages 162 and 190. So obviously you need the pagination from this UK edition, which would now be a Voyager or Gollancz. Sladek was quite similar to Dick, and the thing about Sladek was because he was an American writer, a new wave writer, and he spent some time in London in Moorcock's New World stables, and he, to me, was almost like a cross between Vonnegut and early Vonnegut and Philip K. Dick, and he's dead now sadly as well. And but he's quite pioneering, and sort of one of his works which is of interest, which I'll pick up here, is a short story collection called The Steam-Driven Boy and Other Strangers. Now, what's interesting about this is really a series of parodies and pastiches of other science fiction writers. And this is another reason probably why Sladek was chosen to fill in the gaps in the final revised edition of The Unteleported Man, which became published as Lies Inc. You look through this and you see all sorts of great, you know, parodies. There's Edgar Allan Poe one, a Wells one, a Hugo Gernsback one, Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, Cordwainer Smith, and J.G. Ballard. So, and they're all very convincing. You know, Sladek really was a gadfly. He was fantastic. So if you ever see a copy of that, pick it up. His books are increasingly uncommon, and he seems to have fallen from favour, which is a great shame, but that's great stuff. So Sladek filled out those 2 pages, and the book was published finally in its final form as Lies Inc. So before we talk about the actual textual differences, I just want to talk about the plot and the characters a bit. Basically, as with most Dick's things, it's the near future. Of course, when he wrote the book, Berlin Wall had only recently gone up, and in Dick's future, which is set late 20th century, of course, it doesn't really matter. You know, these dates are almost arbitrary, and there's a reunited Germany. And of course, we've had that since, you know, the early 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, what have you. And the reunited Germany poses rather a threat to the UN. And in Dick's work, there's a tendency to sort of always use the Germanic, not quite interchangeably with fascism and Nazism, but to look at German Romanticism and how that influenced the Nazis, and to sort of say something about the Teutonic frame of mind as Dick saw it, as embodied in its perversion, the Nazis. So the world is also overpopulated, and there's a solution, which is there's one planet which can be colonized that's being discovered, and that's a planet at Formalhaut 9. It's called Whale's Mouth, and the colony on the planet is called New Colonized Land. So you've got these 3 names, which is typical of Dick's richness of sort of literary variety. And the story is about a Jewish entrepreneur called Rachmael ben Appelbaum, a very obviously Semitic name, and his father has been running a company, and it's what they call a drayage company. They've got spaceships, and they're moving things around the solar system, and they've built this flagship, which is the only remaining asset of the company, because Rachmael's father has committed suicide because of the parlous sort of financial situation that the company is in. And the company's in that situation because a rival firm has created a teleportation device which can just teleport people straight to the new colony, but it's one way, and there are broadcasts that come back and show you this sort of like beautiful sort of life on this glorious planet. And of course, this colonization thing is a common theme with Dick. You know, we see it hinted at in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. We see the reality of a Martian colony in the wonderful Martian Time Slip. We're instantly suspicious because we know that in Dick, dystopian backgrounds are the default, and this is something that always gets me. I'm going to digress a moment to when I'm with people say I want to read dystopian novels, and I say to them, well, you know, there's all the obvious ones, there's the Huxleys, the Orwells, what have you, and there's all the ones people are writing now which usually aren't very good. But you know, if you read most science fiction has dystopian background because it is the business of the future to be dangerous, as Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician and philosopher, said. You get the drama and the conflict comes out of dystopia. You don't get it so much in utopia. So Rachmael ben Appelbaum, he has this spaceship, but of course, you know, it would take 18 years apparently to get 24 light years to new colonized land. So, you know, he's in a bit of a state, and he is pursued by his creditors. Both he and the UN are suspicious that there's some sort of plot going on, because the teleportation device is owned by a company which is related to German industrial interests. And there's a firm called Trails of Hoffman who put money into Appelbaum's company, but they also put it into Teleport, the company that invented the teleportation device. So there's something suspicious about investing in both, or so Appelbaum feels. Though, of course, I mean, to many of us, we think, well, you invest in futures. If you've got the money, your investment company, you see what happens. I'll talk about the textual differences now because they're important. So when you read this, it begins with Appelbaum being pursued by a credit balloon, a mechanical device, which is broadcasting his debts to everybody around him as he heads for an appointment with the secret police force Lies Inc., who are helping him. And they're sort of like a sort of detective agency, but they have agendas of their own, hence the name Lies Inc. And that part of the book is at the very beginning, and it's missing from the finished Lies Inc. Lies Inc. opens with a different chapter entirely, a more hallucinatory chapter that was obviously added later on. So the books have different beginnings, and the very beginning of this is never quite taken up fully within the text of this one. So straight away, there's interesting comparisons. What you get then is a situation where the chapters are out of sync. So chapter 3 of Lies Inc., chapter 3 of that one is chapter 2 of this one. Chapter 4 of this one is chapter 3 of that one. So they're slightly out of sync because of the difference in the material at the beginning. There's some other small differences as well. So you get this thing where the chapters are out of sync with each other. It's very interesting to look at the two. You need somebody with you just to flip back and forth the pages, or you'd have to be ambidextrous. So you get that. Chapter 2 of Lies Inc. starts halfway through chapter 1 of this. Confused already? So was I. But that shows you the revision process that Dick undertook in putting this book together from this book. Now, the interesting thing is the Unteleported Man, as it stands, is very short, 124 pages, and it's routine, it's enjoyable, it's a minor Dick novel, there's nothing wrong with the writing, but it is quite routine. It's a routine adventure story, and it reminded me in lots of ways of the basic idea of one of my favourite minor Dick novels, Our Friends from Frolics 8. In this, a man called Thors Pravoni has gone out to the stars to try and find alien help on Earth with a situation where ordinary people are being superseded by superpowered new men. So it's that thing about, you know, can he bring some help back from the stars? And in this, Rachmel Ben Applebaum decides that he's going to take the 18-year journey on board his remaining spaceship to go to Whale's Mouth, new colonized land, former Half 9, to discover what the truth is, because he suspects that it isn't real, and he has proof because he's recorded broadcasts from the planet, and they're fake. So there you go. So you've got these differences with the chapters not fitting and what have you, and then when you get to chapter 7 of The Unteleported Man, which is chapter 8 of Lies Inc., things start to diverge. It becomes a whole new ball game, and then we get the massive revised section, which goes on, and pages 85 to 202 of Lies Inc. are not in The Unteleported Man. The last two chapters in each book are pretty much identical. So it's a different beginning in this one and a big insert. The insert is where things get really strange. This is an easy read. The insert is not such an easy read. So that's the situation we're in with the textual differences. Now, as I've not read the 1983 version, and I confirmed that by looking at my Galactic Central bibliography of PKD, I can't really talk about what that 30,000 words was like in the 60s. So I've got to get a copy, and I'll come back to that another time. So anyway, this is the basic situation. So you've got textual differences. And when you go to the insert section, you see that Dick has taken this basic adventure story and he's put in a lot of the concerns which are in his major novels. So we'll talk about those now. There are obvious literary references straight away. The first literary reference that struck me was the mention of a company called Trails of Hoffman, who are Rachmel's creditors. He owes lots of money to them, and he's got no hope of paying it back. And Trails of Hoffman is, of course, a reference to Tales of Hoffman, which is a title which has often been used many times for different versions of short story collections by the great German romantic figure and major figure in romantic literature, E.T.A. Hoffmann. One of his most famous books in print is the Tomcat Mur book, which I'll show you now. It looks like this. Hoffman is somebody who's referred to more often than read. I've read some, and they are sort of fantastic and fairy tales, a very dark character. And Trails of Hoffman are named this. Why are they named this? Well, it's interesting because, of course, there's a reference there. Now, as I say, one of the concerns in this book is the growing industrial military power of the German Empire on Earth in this story. And, of course, the discoverer of LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, the famous hallucinogen DLSD-25, was a chap called Albert Hoffman, who was a German-speaking Swiss. Now, in World War II, Switzerland was, of course, neutral, and he worked for a film called Sandoz, who was still extant today, and they were a typical Swiss pharmaceutical company. And the Greater Germany is very well known for its industrial prowess before, during, and between the wars. Firms like IG Farben and what have you. And some of those firms were, in those days, implicated in creating things like poison gas and things for the Holocaust, dreadful things like that. But they were a real industrial powerhouse, and that had been the case in German industry for some decades. So Albert Hoffman accidentally discovered LSD. He was working on material derived from a fungus called ergot, and ergot used to grow on wet rye in corn stores in the sort of Middle Ages. And if it got wet, this fungus ergot would grow on the rye. And if you ate bread made from this rye, you would have hallucinations, and they were then called St. Anthony's Fire. So what they were trying to do, Albert Hoffman and his sort of fellow workers, they were trying to work out if they could derive a drug from ergot that would be useful for treating migraines. And he derived different compounds from it. He came across the sort of 25th derivative, did some experiments, didn't think anything of it, but one day he had a particular presentiment, as he said, and he went back to it and he took a small dose and he started to trip. He then took a bicycle ride home and he started to hallucinate, and he made notes. And from that, Sandoz developed a chemical called delicid. And delicid was used in the 1950s, experimental treatment of people with schizophrenia and addictions. It was quite successful with addictions. It was also used by the CIA in secret trials. I could go on and on about this, but that's not the interesting part. The point is that Philip K. Dick, as we know, was interested in hallucinatory experiences. He was a drug user in the 60s and 70s. He'd been a user of amphetamines in the 50s when he was busily writing all those short stories to try and get his career going while trying to write mainstream novels and SF novels as well. And of course, Dick was interested in ontological questions. What is real? So that was quite interesting. So Trails of Hoffman refers both to the fantastic sort of influence of German Romanticism and possibly upon the chemical industry, and how Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD, sort of embodied that. So it's quite interesting how you've got those two things there. So they tie into a much broader swathe of Dick's thematic work and material. And of course, we'd seen this before, he said, reaching out for aid again, in Dick's celebrated novel, The Man in the High Castle. This is a first edition, and there's a little penguin postcard in the back. There's a picture of a youthful Phil. And this was gifted to me, funnily enough, many, many years ago in the 90s by a German customer of mine when I was running a mail order outlet. He was a chap called Helmut Schmidt. I think he's no longer with us. He was one of two major partners in a very large German marketing and advertising firm. We were very successful in the 60s and 70s. And he's a lovely guy. He was a real bibliophile, and he had an amazing collection of books. And he would ring up and order things. And he bought many scarce things from us and lots of new signed first editions coming out. And Helmut one day got talking to me on the phone. He used to generally talk to my partner, the video widow. And he would speak to me occasionally on the telephone. And he discovered I liked science fiction, and he said, when I was living in the States, he was a madman. He worked on Madison Avenue, late 50s, early 60s. And he said, I used to read lots of science fiction then, it was really great, and it was a great time in SF and what have you. I got home one day and there was a huge box of books on my doorstep. Lots of American Book Club editions and some firsts, all sorts of things. And one of them was that copy of The Man in the High Castle. And it was... when I stood in front, I said, look, you really shouldn't do this. I'm not supposed to accept things. That's my job. He said, no, you must have them. So it's really, really kind of him. Obviously it's a very uncommon book. So anyway, going back to the point, Dick obviously was concerned with fascism and how he used the example of Nazism as a key example of fascism, and how he was concerned about how German Romanticism had partially inspired the Nazis to go to such extremes and have folk beliefs and what have you. And the whole sort of panic about the Teutonic sort of mindset of people like Wagner and Nietzsche and what have you. So there you go. So that was a concern. So the book, when you read Unteleported, man, you're thinking, what is actually at Whale's Mouth in new colonized land? Is it just sort of like some sort of death camp where people are projected there and, you know, they're just pushed into sort of ovens or what have you, and that deals with the population problem? So, you know, and obviously because Rachmael Ben Applebaum is a Jew, you know, there's a political dimension. You know, is he being picked on by Trails of Hoffman simply because he's Jewish, you know, because there's racism involved? So, you know, so there are all those questions there. And of course, World War II was only 20 years prior, and, you know, Dick had grown up during it and what have you. So, you know, it is quite interesting stuff. Of course, in the expanded middle section, you know, the main question that you're confronted with time and time again are the ontological question, what is real? And, you know, it's one of those things. Basically, there's a point in the plot where Rachmael is transported, or appears to be transported, to Whale's Mouth, and then he's shot with an LSD dart, and then you were not certain whether what happens to the characters, so the whole of that insert area is real or not. And the point of view switches between it's a third person point of view, but it sort of looks omnisciently, as Dick's things tend to do. It looks at what happens to Rachmael, it looks what happens to Matson, who is the head of Lies Inc., and it also looks at Freya, who is an employee of Lies Inc., and Matson's mistress, who seems to be becoming involved with Ben Applebaum. And, you know, it's very, very disorienting indeed, and very, very confusing. But it is reminiscent of some of the other things in Dick's work that came after the original version of The Unteleported Man. To me, there's very much a sense that what Dick was trying to do with the expanded revision, the extra material that became Lies Inc., was to sort of contextualize a minor novel into a major novel in his canon, to show that he was, you know, tackling the same themes as he was in books like The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which is one of his most psychedelic books, as anybody who knows his work knows. So there's a sort of effort, you feel, to sort of fit the book into that context. Also, because we know that 30,000 words were revised quite shortly before Dick's death, he was obviously thinking about Scanner Darkly, and there are moments in the middle section where there's a cast of sort of paranoid schizophrenic characters who may be real, they may be not. They seem to be under the influence of psychedelic drugs as well, to Scanner Darkly. And, you know, I have to say that the middle section of Lies Inc. is extremely dark, confusing, difficult to read, multi-layered, clever. It really does mess with your head. So, you know, there is a sort of similarity to that. So the book then does fit rather better in with Dick's more serious, more claimed oeuvre, as opposed to being a minor throwaway thing from the 60s. So, you know, is it successful? Well, you know, I would say probably not. I want to get that other revised edition, and then I want to read the book again, because it's just been filling my head the last few days, and I need to leave it a year or so and approach it again and read it, you know, with more time to think about it. But it is absolutely fascinating, and I just really couldn't say enough good about sort of doing this exercise and looking at these things, because it does deepen your sort of pleasure and enjoyment of his oeuvre, and seeing where he was trying to sort of construct his career. Because of course, you know, a real writer had to earn money, and it was a way of getting the book reissued in a better form, not just for artistic reasons but for financial ones, and it would go on from there. Now, of course, finally on the themes, Dick's experience of hallucinogens, you know, it is come up as in Stigmata and Scanner Darkly, and, you know, it sort of rears its ugly head in terms of his general interests about what was real or not, and whether there was a way of merging the subjective reality of, you know, the eidos cosmos, the personal subjective reality, with the more objective shared consensual reality of the koinos cosmos. So, you know, these were sort of big things for him. So it is quite an important book to reread in the context of Valis and the Valis trilogy, and that thing where he was looking at the religious questions. And religion comes up a lot in the book. I mean, for example, there's a character Freya, And Freya works for Trails of Hoffman. Now, of course, Freya was a Norse god, so it's a sort of Germanic Nordic thing. And Freya stood for love, beauty, and sex. And when in Norse cosmology, when warriors die in battle, she would receive half of them. Some of them would go to Valhalla, and half of them would go to her, where they would be comforted. And that's quite interesting in itself. And there is suspicion, as I say, of the Germanic in this book and other Dick books. However, this shows the sort of caring side, because Freya's not a bad character. She's one of the good guys. There's also moments where Dick's personal Christian interests come to the fore. And Rachmael ben Appelbaum, of course, is a Jew. He's not a Christian, he's Jewish, but he's Jewish, by sort of birth. And there are moments where he calls on Abba, which is Father, God. And the use of the word Abba is an Aramaic word, and it's only used 3 times in the Bible, all in the New Testament. It's only ever used by Jesus Christ and Paul. So it's a Christian usage. It's very, very interesting. So that suggests that Rachmael ben Appelbaum is actually, despite his Jewish sort of heritage, is actually a Christian like Philip K. Dick. So that's there as well, for those of you who are interested in those questions. So this places Lysink in a different part of the oeuvre. It sort of makes a bold, but I think flawed and probably a failed attempt to sort of place Lysink alongside important works like Scanner Darkly and Three Stigmata, while at the same time having the taint of, supposedly less important works like Our Friends from Frolics 8. So that's an interesting one as well. Obviously for Dick, the Unteleported Man had a conventional structure, and it wasn't enough for him. It had 2 antagonists and Rachmael, who was a small man, but in Lysink, Dick seems to disorient us with that middle section and get us to appreciate the ontological nightmare of, his state of mind, of drug use, of schizophrenia, of all those things, the questions about what is real, and, to reflect on his drug experiences, like in Scanners. So it's kind of an anti-drug thing as well, and different factions emerge in the course of the middle section, which I won't tell you about. So, if you can get hold of both editions and read The Unteleported Man first, leave it a while and then go back and read Lysink, because you really enjoy the difference between the two. Because, in some ways, Unteleported Man, despite being routine, is more successful, whereas Lysink doesn't quite come off, I think, There's metafiction in it. There are moments where books are referred to. There's a book in which the characters discover, what their fate may be, and the machinations of the various nefarious bodies involved, bureaucratic organizations come to the fore. So it's the sort of thing you could talk about all day. One more thing I wanted to say. Whenever I thought of Lysink, I often thought of a novel by Stanislaw Lem called The Futurological Congress. And I may have mentioned this before. This came out in the early 70s. I think it was 71 in Poland and about 74 English translation. And this is about one of Lem's perennial characters, Ishon Tichi, who goes to a congress about overpopulation and environmental problems, interestingly enough, in Costa Rica. It's very knockabout and funny and silly, but it is very reminiscent of Dick. Now, of course, Lem was of the opinion that Dick was one of the few American science fiction writers worth reading. So, of course, he only read him in translation and vice versa. So we have this problem of, non-shared languages. But eventually, Lem started to critique Dick more, and there was a sort of, falling out via letters between the two of them. But I often wondered whether this was influenced by Lysink, but of course the material in Lysink which resembles this, because at some point the central character Ishon and everybody get infected with LSD in the water, and there's other hallucinogenic gases and what have you, and it goes on from there. But it really is kind of an elaborate joke, really. You could see that there's the possibility that Lem was parodying Dick in that, or looking at some of his concerns, but he approached them in a different way because of translation, because he's East European and what have you. So it does come across that way. And I know I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again. For those of you interested in SF cinema, and for those of you who like the rotoscope animation of Scanner Darkly, I mean, I'm not an animation guy, it's not really my thing. It's, I can appreciate it, it's very clever, but it never really hits me where I live. This is the Congress, which came out a few years ago, and it's very loosely based on the Futurological Congress. by Stanislaw Lem. It invents characters. There's a frame narrative that's not in it. Teachy's not in it. What it does, though, is go into the hallucinatory side in a big way. So there's some sort of real world shooting, and then there's a lot of animation. And funny enough, someone who does a voiceover bit of acting in this is the guy who played Don Draper in Mad Men. So it's rather like a reference back to what I was saying about my customer Helmut, who gave me my copy of Man in the High Castle. And also Paul Giamatti's in this, and of course he was slated, he wants to play Philip K. Dick in a film he'd call The Owl in Daylight. It's never happened. And you know, it's really, really good. It makes some comments about SF which are interesting. It's dystopian. It's a very interesting film. It's flawed, but it's well worth seeing. And if you like animation and general strangeness, you love it. So do check that out. So that's my thoughts on Lies Inc. and the Unteleported Man. I've been obsessing over it the last couple of nights and reading it and rereading it and making reams and reams of notes. I could have said a lot more about it. I will come back to it when I manage to get that Berkeley edition and see what you think. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe. There will be more PKD to come. I think this has come out of the fact that having done that PKD video the other day, and I've also just reread an R.A. Lafferty, I've been completely infected by the utter bonkers side of SF, which is a side I love. So I'm going to sign out for now and try and edit this into some sort of coherent form. But of course, for all I know, I've just been shot with an LSD dart. Bye for now.